Okay, good evening, one and all. We are meeting for Shabbat HaGadol Drasha under the most unusual of circumstances. Having said that, it is a pleasure to see you all. Yaakov, Jacob, that's a beautiful hat. We are enjoying that very much. And I want to begin by saying I've been asked by Billy Nissel to dedicate this evening's shir in memory of his father and grandfather and uncle, Shlomo Meir ben Chaim Lev Azriel, Moshe Aaron ben Yisrael, and Chaim Lev Azriel ben Nisan. And I'd like to dedicate our learning this evening in their memory, and also to another extraordinary group of people. And that group of people is, of course, you. We are all going through this crisis in different ways and feeling its challenges differently. Some, this is a time of immense boredom and incarceration. For others, it is a time of immense stress and busyness. For others, it is a time of uncertainty in all sorts of ways. And to find ways to make meaning, to come together, to continue to live lives of Jewish purpose and Jewish drive and community is nothing short of heroic. And I want to dedicate our learning this evening in the honor of all of you, and in the hopes that very soon we all come together in the shul that hopefully you will see on your screens in front of you. Now we begin. Now there's nothing like a little bit of drama in the evening, so I thought I would add some musical accompaniment. It will die down shortly. But Shabbat HaGadol has been called Shabbat HaGadol for a whole slew of reasons, one of which is great crowds assembled to discuss great subjects. And though we are not crowded into one room this evening, we are here to discuss a great subject, one that touches on the core of what it means to be free, what it means to thrive in a time of crisis, and fundamentally what it means to be human. We will weave together the thought of E.M. Forster and the Chazon Ish and the Prophet Malachi and Simon Sharma and Rav Asher Weiss to steer us through what we are going to call this evening the talking cure, how the Seder saves us. And of course, the phrase, for those of you who are psychoanalytically connected, is a phrase that was used by Sigmund Freud to describe psychoanalysis in an age when pills and medicines and surgeries and therapies and electrotherapies were the primary outlet to solve psychological instability. He suggested, building off the work of others, that talking through our issues, that giving voice to the voices in our heads is a way of curing us. In fact, one of his predecessors also called this process chimney sweeping, for reasons that are beyond me and beyond my Google search capacity. But what I want to do is appropriate that phrase, the talking cure, to speak about what we do on Seder night. This is not a psychoanalytic moment, though some of you may decide to recline on couches for the evening, but we're going to see how the Seder saves us. And to do that, I want to ask you all a question. You don't have to respond, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. Ordinarily, there is a question that many of us practice differently about who reads the Haggadah on Seder night. Of course, we all do, but some families, they have a leader of the Seder who reads the Haggadah and everybody listens along quietly. There are some families where everybody reads it and sings it all together, and there are some families where people go around taking turns. I grew up in a house where it depended on which of my grandfathers took charge or appropriated the evening, as my father might say. When he came round, one grandfather read the whole thing, the other appointed people to do it, and that's the way my father did it as well, and that's the way I've done it in the past. But I'm sure everybody has memories and experiences with different figures leading different kinds of Sedarim. And the question here turns on the point of whether reading the Haggadah is actually an obligation. Do I have an obligation to sit there and read the words? Is this a form of prayer? Is this a form of kriyah, of learning? Or can I just listen to somebody else? And to answer that question, We need to go on a journey through a halachic jungle that begins 2,660 years ago with a king living at crossroads in Jewish life. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see King Yoshiyahu. King Yoshiyahu was the 16th king in the southern kingdom of Judah. He lived in 640 BCE and came to the throne at the ripe old age of 8, after his father was assassinated, and he reigned for more than 3 decades, 31 years. And in this moment, you see the grandson of Manasseh, Manasseh being the archetypal sinful king responsible for spreading idolatry and overruling normative Jewish theology, of strewing the temple with idols. His grandson Yoshiyahu led a religious revival and appointed his high priest Chilkiyahu to renovate the Bet Mikdash. And while Chilkiyahu was renovating the Bet Mikdash, clearing the temple grounds of all the carnage caused by Yoshiyahu's grandfather, he found something breathtaking. Look in the source on your page, source 1. V'yomer Chilkiyahu HaKohen HaGadol. The high priest Chilkiyahu said, Al Shafan HaSofer, to the scribe Shafan, Sefer HaTorah Matzati Bevet Hashem. I found a scroll of laws in the temple. And this was astonishing to this high priest. V'yiten Chilkiyahu et HaSefer al Shafan v'yikra'eu. He gave this book to the scribe, and the scribe read it. Equally astonished, V'yavo Shafan HaSofer el HaMelech. Shafan the scribe brought this in his shock to the king. V'yaged Shafan HaSofer HaMelech, and Shafan said to the king, Sefer Natan li Chilkiyahu HaKohen, the high priest gave me this book. There is something astonishing that is going from the high priest to the head of scribal authority, to the head of administrative and political authority. V'yikra'eu Shafan lifnei HaMelech, and those words are bolded for a purpose. The scribe Shafan read it to the king. The king was awed. I have ellipses here in the text, but the king tears his clothes on hearing these words, and he sends his high priest along with an entourage from the political authority to the prophetic authority. Go seek out God, figure out what this omen means, he says. V'yelech Chilkiyahu HaKohen el Chulda HaNeviah. And Chilkiyahu, the high priest, goes to the prophetess Chulda. Anyone know what Chulda translates as?
Weasel.
Weasel. I have a friend that I grew up with who, when they were born, the parents, not particularly religious, wanted to give her a name beginning with Chet and asked the rabbi for a good name. The rabbi said Chulda was a prophetess, so they chose the name. Later found out it meant weasel. Were a little unhappy with the rabbi, but it is a stark figure in Jewish history, Chulda the prophetess. And she sat in the second quarter of Jerusalem. They spoke to her about what had happened and unfolded on temple grounds and then in the royal palace. V'tamar aleihem, and she said to them, Ko amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael, so says God, the King of Israel, the God of Israel. Hinenei mevi ra'ah lemakom hazeh, I will bring evil to this place, va'al yoshvav, and its inhabitants, et kol divrei hasefer asher kara melech Yehudah, all the words of the book that was read by whom? By the king of Judah. Now, on the face of it, this is a moment of tragedy with a looming curse enunciated by a prophetess to a high priest that will pass it on to the head of political administrative authority. But our sages are not content to look at big picture tragedies and narrative moments. They are keyed into minor inconsistencies in the text, seeking to draw meaning from what biblical critics nearly 2,000 years later would see as problematic. And they said, hold on a minute, who read the text? In the first part of the source, V'yikra'u Shafan lifnei HaMelech, the scribe read the text before the king, and now the prophetess, the all-seeing, divinely inspired Chulda, says the book which the king read. And while others would be more forgiving to a text and move on to the thrust of its message, the sages could not move on. Who read the text? And there are two answers provided to this. First, we have the Radak. And the Radak says, I need to chill out. This is a colloquial attribution. We do this all the time. We speak about the temple that Solomon built. Guess what? Solomon didn't build the temple. He hired construction people to build the temple. And the Radak says, he said to the scribe, read it. It basically means he read it. This may come as a surprise to many of you, but many famous presidential speeches that were given were not written by famous presidents. They were written by famous presidents' team of speechwriters. But we always say, as President X wrote or said, it is a colloquial attribution to people in power that when things happen under their jurisdiction, they get given the credit. That's what he says, the Radak. But Chazal go a different direction. This is in Sukkah. And the Gemara says, hold on a minute. It says the scribe read it. Chulda says the king read it. And this is not just a colloquial slippage. There is an embedded message about halachic life that the prophetess is teaching. She is teaching right at the bottom, underlined in red. Mikan l'shomea ka'oneh. She is teaching a halachic concept that if one hears something, it is as if they said it. One has the power to listen and fulfill obligations to speak. Give me an example. When we do this all the time, we have an obligation to say something, people listen and they fulfill their obligation. Give me an example.
Kiddush.
Correct. Havdalah, Kiddush. All the time we hear other people say brachot, we say amen, we fulfill our obligation. We have an obligation to say that bracha, but we listen shomer ka'oneh. And the question is, when it comes to the Haggadah, can I just listen to someone else speak it? I need to know whether this principle that I can listen and fulfill my obligations to speak, if it's universal. And to answer if it's universal, we have to ask how it works. And to do that, we begin with what used to be an incredibly common occurrence. And please God, very soon will be too. And this happens to me all the time. Davening in a minyan, you're standing davening the Amida, you take a little longer than the group would like. They go ahead. Maybe you give them an indication to go ahead with the repetition without you. They come to Kedusha, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. What do? I'm in the middle of davening. Do I stop and listen to Kadosh, Kadosh? Do I carry on and pretend I can't hear anything? What do? What's the answer?
Depends where you are.
You stop.
Excellent. I heard somebody say you stop and somebody say you carry on. Correct. It's a debate. Number 4, you have Rashi, and Rashi straightforwardly says, Hamid Palalim B'tzibur, someone davening with the congregation, V'shalir Tzibur Amakodesh or Yehishmei Rabbah or Kedusha, Yishtaku B'tfilatan V'yishmeu B'kavana. Stop davening. Stop where you are in the middle of a bracha. Just stop dead in the water and listen. V'harei hen ka'onin. And if you listen, it's as if you're saying the words. U'chashiyigma kedusha yachzu tfilatan. And when the kedusha finishes, carry on davening. That seems to be a pretty straightforward reading of this principle. That if I listen, it's as if I said it. I fulfill my obligation. In source 5, we have an astonishing assumption on the part of Rashi's descendants and disciples. Rabbeinu Tam says as follows: Hayu omrim. They said, Adarabah. On the contrary, with all due reverence, Rabbi Rashi, which of course is repetitive, Rabbi Rashi, if you're going to tell me that listening is like speaking, have a hefsek, havsaka im shotek. It's a hefsek. Hold on a minute. If I'm in the middle of davening, am I allowed to stop and say kadosh, kadosh, kadosh? No. So if I stop and I listen and it's as if I'm saying it, that's an interruption. And what we see here is an astonishing divergence in understanding this principle that will ripple through a whole series of ramifications in Jewish ritual life and Jewish personal life. How does this principle operate? Shomea ka'oneh. And this is how it is summed up by the Biur Halacha. The Biur Halacha says as follows. Yesh omrim, there are those who say, the kivin the shomea ka'oneh, hu ka'oneh mamash. And this is Tosfot. Tosfot is saying, if I listen to you, it is as if I am speaking. But the other view is Shomer Ka'ona Eino Kedibur Mamash. I'm not actually speaking. And if I could boil this down for you outside the text for a moment, for Rashi, Shomer Ka'ona means that if I have an obligation to speak, but I pay close attention, listening is good enough. We lower the bar on the expectation of your halachic obligation. All you have to do is listen. Tosfot says, Shomer Ka'ona means no such thing. Never in halachic life, when you have an obligation to say something, can you merely listen. Listening doesn't work. But there is a loophole that if you pay close attention, you have an alignment of larynxes. You have a bonding of voice boxes, and whatever is coming out of the mouth of the person speaking, it is as if that is coming out of your mouth. You are saying, you are throwing your voice and saying whatever is coming out of their mouth. We allow this virtual connection through Shomer Ka'ona. And while that sounds like an abstract distinction without a difference, we are going to find a whole slew of differences. Where for Rashi, if you merely listen, that's good enough. But for Tosfot, listening never works. But Shomer Ka'ona means that you virtually bond with the speaker, and it is as if you are projecting the words out of their mouth. Now, before we move on to the ramifications, we should ask bottom line, what do I do if I'm in the middle of davening the Amida, it comes to Kedusha, should I stop or not? And here we have the Bet Yosef, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, saying as follows. Katav Rabbeinu Yonah says, V'davar talui ba'amudei olam. This matter depends on the pillars of the universe, meaning Rashi and Tosfot debate this. Ein lanu koach la'achriya beinehem. We don't have the power to decide between the two, and words of halachic life that will ring beautifully in everybody's ears. The Aved Kamar Aved, the Aved Kamar Aved. Whatever he does, whatever she does, whatever you do works. You've got something to rely on. This is a view we cannot arbitrate on our own. And I will note that when I was in yeshiva, I somehow built a reputation for being a nag and annoying to Rav Lichtenstein. And I made a point after Shacharis every day that I could, or that he was there, going up to him in the yeshiva after Shacharis to ask him a question. Because when I was in high school, one of my teachers said, when it comes to Gadolim, when it comes to great mentors, you have to have chutzpah. You have to go up and annoy them, because how else are you going to build a relationship? He should have said, how else can you build an annoying relationship? But nonetheless, he said, this is how you build a relationship. So I went up to Rav Lichtenstein every day. I'd ask him questions. I'd learn something in the Mishnah Berurah, go ask him. There was one point at which the Mishnah, I shouldn't really be confessing this to all of you virtually, especially when it's being recorded. But there is a discussion in the Mishnah Berurah, if you're wearing tefillin, one is not allowed to pass wind. But the Mishnah Berurah suggests that if you move it off the place it's meant to be, it's okay. So what did I do? Don't get carried away. I went to Rav Lichtenstein and I asked him what he thought. And then it dawned on me in the middle of asking him that I'm asking Rav Lichtenstein about passing wind while wearing my tefillin. So that's what you get for annoying Gedolim. But I did establish a relationship that I was very proud to have and was very meaningful to me. And you should know my third year in Gush, I did apologize to him for all the nagging and the nuisance. And I told him that I was encouraged by teachers to have chutzpah. And he said, you got nothing to apologize for, which I'm sure is not the case, but was very sweet nonetheless on his part. And I was very grateful for him saying that. And one of the times I asked him, what should we do when it comes to this situation? I'm davening, it comes to Kedusha, should I stop and listen or not? And Rav Lichtenstein, like many briskers, was a master of analytical abstractions and said, so what you should do is you should stop and then have in mind, if this is going to be a hefsek, I'm not paying attention. But if it's not going to be a hefsek and we follow Rashi, I'm paying attention. So I should sit there, not interrupting my davening by having two thoughts in mind at the same time, whether I'm really paying attention or not, which is convoluted and complicated and very brisker. And I went to Rav Lichtenstein's son, Rav Moshe, to ask him what he thought on another day in another circumstance. And he said, do you really think that works? That sounds crazy. And I said, well, that's what your father, Rav Lichtenstein, said. Yeah, I understand. But do you think that works? That doesn't make any sense. You're trying not to interrupt by having two convoluted thoughts at the same time, which was great and helpful. But either way, whatever you do, although John Kramer was indeed correct. The Shulchan Aruch rules, Einu posek, lo l'kadosh v'lo kedusha, ele yishtog, you should go quiet, you should listen, you should stop. That's the normative view of the Shulchan Aruch, but many people do different things. Now, here come the other ramifications. We begin with Kohanim. Any priests online? Any Kohanim online? Anyone
Yes.
married to priests online? Anyone find Kohanim particularly tuneful when it comes to Berachat Kohanim? I see a lot of
Yes.
muted people
Yes.
there agreeing with that.
Only Yishai Gross.
There you go, Yishai Gross. I'm sure
That's
he'll like
why the
that.
Nevi'im sang in the Beis Hamikdash, not the Kohanim.
Yeah, and people have said there was a reason for that. But we have many talented Kohanim. And actually, number 9, we have the source for Kohanim blessing the people. Daber el Aaron ve'el banav lemor. God says to Moshe to speak to his brother and their children to tell them, Ko tevarach et bnei Yisrael, go and bless the Jewish people as follows, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, and that is the source for the priests being appointed to bless the rest of the people on God's behalf, to be human agents of divine affection. And on the basis of a slight textual excess in source 10, the Gemara says, Ko tevarachu tells you what? The kol ram. Kohanim, when they do the priestly blessing, should do so in a loud voice. And now for those of you who've been frustrated with Kohanim, who seem less tuneful or to be screechy or shouty, this is the evidence that they have a source. The kol ram, they should do it out loud. Ka'adam sha'omer lachavero. This agency that is bequeathed to the Kohanim on behalf of God is not to be whispered or mumbled or muttered. It is to be said b'kol ram, with confidence, with conviction. It is to be enunciated so that people can hear the words of God. Now, why this is crucial to our subject is because the command given to the Kohanim is not just to say words like when we're davening. We have a command to say things. They have a command to say things in a particular way, to say things so that it can be heard. So here comes the question. In the next box, the Beit Halevi, who is an ancestor of all the Soloveitchiks, had a case where Rav Betzalel HaKohen of Vilna went to Italy to visit Trieste. And in Trieste, he found they had an interesting custom. When it came to Birchat Kohanim, only one Kohen got up to do the duchening. And all the other Kohanim listened along and fulfilled their obligation through him. And he asked the question, can they fulfill their obligation to bless the people just by listening? What's the concept? Shemei Kona. They heard. It's as if they said it. And this is what the Beit Halevi says. Ikar hadavar, right before the red line. Ikar hadavar lo nahira klal. This makes no sense to me at all. The Shomea Ka'ona, because this concept that me listening helps me fulfill an obligation to speak, that works when all I need to do is say words. There is a dispensation made by Chulda Hanavi'ah through her prophetic insight that if I've got an obligation to say something and just say it, I can just listen. There's a dispensation that listening counts if I pay close attention. Aval Birchat Kohanim Tzarech Kol Ram. But Birchat Kohanim isn't just an obligation to speak. It's an obligation to speak so that other people can hear me. Ka'adam ha'omer lachavero ubezeh lo shayach shomea ka'ona. It doesn't count. Dahari aniyato, because that listening that I'm doing can't be heard. I can't do a technical fulfillment of my need to speak through a dispensation to listen, because my obligation is not just to speak, it's to speak out loud. Now, that follows the view of Rashi, that this is about just listening. But if you take the view of Tosfot, as the Chazon Ish is about to take, that actually Shomea Ka'ona is a fantastical mechanism. And I think the best way to elucidate it, as I mentioned at the outset, is through a thought relating to E.M. Forster. E.M. Forster was a novelist and writer in Britain who actually wrote a piece called Jew Consciousness. He was part of a group of publishers not known for their friendly views to Jews. And he was writing during the war years of the Second World War, and he was struck by the viciousness and the venom of anti-Semitism, and he wrote an essay called Jew Consciousness about the need for universal human beings to pay attention to the plight of the Jew. And he was described by an author who wrote his biography, Wendy Moffat, wrote as follows, that to be in his presence was to be seduced almost by what you would call an inverse charisma. An inverse charisma. Now, charisma is the ability through speech to move and to persuade and to connect. An inverse charisma would be the ability through listening to connect and to move and to touch and to bond. And for Tosfot, that's what Shomer Ka'ona is. It is an attachment through inverse charisma that, as I said, aligns the larynx. When I listen to you, your words are coming out of my mouth. This is not just me fulfilling my obligation by listening. Our connection means that I am speaking. So the Chazon Ish, in source number 12, we don't have to read it inside. He says, well, okay, we'll read this bit inside. This is a new fantastical mechanics in halachic life. What does it do? It unites the listener and the speaker. It bonds them. And that speech and that oral capacity through inverse charisma connect, and it's as if I'm speaking. So for him, for the Kohanim listening, if they express orally that inverse charisma, they fulfill their obligation, because Shomer Ka'ona is not just listening and fulfilling your obligation by doing that. It is an inverse charisma that means that that speech is being generated by my vocal cord. So if that Kohen is saying it out loud, it's as if I'm saying it out loud. There is no gap, there is no distinction. And this distinction is going to flow through a whole slew of cases that relate to Purim and Sfirat HaOmer and Brachot, and we will breeze through them at the speed of a bullet train. First, we have Megillah on Purim. There are various parts of the Megillah when we pause and the congregation says a verse out loud, and then the reader says the verse out loud again. Now, I may be mistaken. It was a busy and stressful time. It was only 4 weeks ago. But I don't recall on Purim night us stopping for everybody to say the 10 names of Haman. You can correct me if I'm wrong, and you can support me if I'm right. But in our shul, I think the Baal Korah didn't stop before the 10 names of Haman. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct. Okay, that was correct. So there are shuls where that is done. In fact, almost every other shul I've been at, that's been the case, where the chazan stops, the Baal Korah stops. We all say the 10 names out loud to ourselves, and then the chazan dives in.
Oh.
And it strikes me,
Okay, thanks.
in the words of the Tzafnat Paneach, that the reason for that is there is an obligation on the part of the Baal Korah to say all 10 names in one breath, b'neshima achat, which is why sometimes there's a pause, the Baal Korah goes, nobody hears anything, but they get it out in one breath. And here the Tzafnat Paneach says, the reason that we stop to let everybody say those 10 names themselves is because you cannot fulfill the obligation of hearing that part of the Megillah through Shomer Ka'ona. Like Rashi, all I have to do, I have a dispensation to listen when I need to speak. But those 10 names, there isn't just an obligation to speak. There's an obligation to say those names in one breath. And breathing has no connection to hearing. They are operating on different realms. Speech is linked to breathing, listening is not. So I can't just listen and fulfill my obligation to say it in one breath. I have to do it myself, which the Rogatchover, who is the Tzafnat Paneach, says that's why there's a custom in many Megillot to have the names written in large font. Because at that point, the Baal Korah would lift up the Megillah so everyone in shul could see it, say it to themselves, then he'd put it down, and then he would do it. So that argument unfolds here as well. When it comes to those 10 names being said in one breath, can I fulfill that through Shomer Ka'ona? Because like Tosfot, if I'm listening through inverse charisma, I'm connecting my vocal cords to them. They're doing it in one breath, I'm doing it in one breath. Or we more like Rashi, that Shomer Ka'ona is a technical dispensation to listen when there's an obligation to speak. The next difference comes up in an interesting case, where if you listen to half a bracha from someone, and then you say the other half yourself. You're listening to Kiddush, you hear the first half, and you say, okay, I caught that half on you. I'm going to do the next half myself. If you believe, like Rashi, that I can fulfill my obligation through listening when I need to speak, in theory, the whole bracha should flow. I'm listening. This is me listening, fulfilling my obligation, and I'm just going to shift gears and start speaking, and I can do the whole bracha. But the Chazon Ish, following again the view of Tosfot, says that doesn't work. The first half of the bracha through Shemei Ka'ona, I'm fulfilling the bracha through your vocal cords, not through my ears. So if you're speaking over there, and that's how I fulfill my obligation, and now I start speaking, I have bifurcated the bracha and it doesn't work. That's another interesting case. Another case, what happens if you're not sure whether you said a bracha? You have a safek bracha. What do we usually say when it comes to a safek with a bracha?
Lahakel.
Lahakel. We usually say, if you have a doubt whether you said a bracha that you needed to say, don't say it. Why? Why don't say it? It's just a bracha. Say it. Why not say it again?
Bracha levatala.
Bracha levatala, because if I say it again, I'm taking God's name in vain. That's a complicated side question, but that's the principle. So what happens if I'm not sure if I said a bracha, and then I see somebody else is about to say that bracha that I need to say? Can I come along and say, just stop, I'm going to listen through Shomei Ka'oneh, I'm going to fulfill my bracha through listening in case I didn't fulfill my obligation already. So for Rashi, that works, because those are two separate operations. Either I said it or I didn't, I'm not sure, but now I'm going to listen and I'm going to go through that loophole. For the Chazon Ish, if I listen through Shomei Ka'oneh, what am I doing? I'm saying the bracha myself. Me speaking, I am ventriloquizing through their vocal cords. And it's the same thing as a bracha levatala. And that's an astonishing thought in source 15, that I might be guilty of transgressing God's name in vain by listening to somebody else do it, because my inverse charisma, to reuse that phrase, through listening, I'm going to say God's name in vain. That's how intense this bond, this connection, this virtual link is between me and the speaker in Shomei Ka'oneh, that when they speak, I am speaking, and it could be a bracha levatala. There's another significant example when it comes to Sfirat HaOmer. Feel free to read that. We're going to go, because I'm watching the time, on to the next case, which of course is our opening case. It is the case of Pesach Haggadah. Do I have an obligation to read the text of the Haggadah? Can that obligation be fulfilled by me listening to somebody else? And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, we're all going to have different practices here. I know sitting at the Seder table with Miriam for the first time after we got married, I noticed as people were going around the table reading, she would kind of read it quietly to herself. And I was quite surprised by that. And that's not because I came with a wealth of halachic background. That's because that wasn't what I was brought up doing. And I never really thought about it. Do I have an obligation to read this? Should I be paying close attention? If I'm not paying close attention, should I be reading this myself? What should I do? And we have our usual two views on this subject, whether Shomei Ka'oneh works or not. And then there is going to be, as our conclusion, a surprise third view. And this is the first view. In source 17, the Minchat Chinuch says, in the context of the Haggadah, Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, B'chol mitzvot hatluyim b'dibur, in any obligation to speak, Echad motzi chavero, somebody else can fulfill the obligation through speaking and the other listening. The Rambam has the same view implicitly. He says, Omer HaKoreh, the reader says, Manishtana halala hazeh mikol halelot. And he repeats this above on the line before. You have Koreh underlined. The Rambam describes the Seder as there being a reader and a group of listeners. Source 19, the Chasam Sofer just says straightforwardly, you fulfill your obligation b'shomea, by listening to the Haggadah. And here we have in a commentary on the Talmud, quoting Maaseh Rav, that was a list of practices by the Vilna Gaon. He says, Nahag Hagra, the Gra had the practice, lahagid ba'atzmo Haggadah, to say the Haggadah himself, v'hotzi et ha'acherim, and to fulfill the obligation of those around him. And for those of you who don't have this practice, it may strike you as a particularly unengaging procedure to sit and listen to somebody read the Haggadah while you sit quietly. But there seem to be many who have this practice. And he points out that when it comes to Birchat Hamazon for benching, in theory, I can fulfill my obligation by listening to other people, but the recommendation is to say it quietly along at the same time. But when it came to the Haggadah, the Gra did not make that recommendation. And in the continuation, he says why? Because when it comes to the Haggadah, Chaviva, it is a beloved text. When it comes to benching, of course, benching and gratitude is beloved, but it's not what we would call unique. It happens all the time. When it comes to the Haggadah, the miracles, the story, the narrative is so involving that I'm going to Yahweh Date V'Sham, I'm going to pay more attention, number one. Number two, when it comes to the Haggadah, he says, you don't have to listen to every word. You hear most of it, you're fine. Now we come to our second view. And here on your screen, if you can see it, there is a painting by Ivan Averzotsky, who was a Russian painter during the Romantic period in the 19th century. And he has this radical image. We're used to imagining the Jewish people crossing the Red Sea in an aura of serenity and celebration. And here he depicts a moment of intense drama, where on the left, the Egyptians are mere feet from the Jews. Moshe is standing at the helm, and the people behind him, drawn towards the fire of God, seem to be enmeshed in terror. And that is a stunning depiction of this moment. And in line of that, we have the second view that says you cannot fulfill your obligation at Seder night by listening to somebody else. You have to say it yourself. We have in source 21. You have an obligation not just to speak, like we do with davening or with benching. What obligation do you have? Like with Birchat Kohanim, you have an obligation to tell someone else. And he points out in the next line, and many people have spoken about that this year, that if one is by themselves, you still have an obligation to go through the story, the Haggadah themselves. This is an obligation, not just to say the words, not just to enunciate the text. This is not a prayer. This is a declaration. It needs to be said as if to another person. And if you are the only one in the room, you need to tell it to yourself as if you are another person. And in source 22, we have the same view. But I want to move on to the third view, which is our final view this evening. And this is the Minchat Asher. This is Rav Asher Weiss. And Rav Asher Weiss has an astonishing argument. He says when it comes to Seder night, to the Haggadah, Shomea Ka'oneh does not work. I cannot fulfill my obligation by listening to somebody else doing my job. But having said that, even though Shomea Ka'oneh does not work, I have no obligation to say every word. Now, how do you bridge that gap? He says, I've got no obligation to say every word, but I can't fulfill my obligation by listening to somebody else who's Shomea Ka'oneh. And this is his answer. Let's read it. Ein hagdarat ha-mitzvah. The definition of this mitzvah on Seder night is not lahashmiya ulesaper la'acherim, to tell somebody else the words of the Haggadah. Elaloma hadvarim b'derech sipur, but to say the words in the form of a story. If I could boil this down more simply, he says as follows: there is not an obligation to say the words of the Haggadah. There is not an obligation to say the words of the Haggadah to somebody else. There is an obligation on Seder night to tell a story. And that stories are told from different perspectives, in different voices, from different angles. Ein akvanat haTorah, underline now, the intention of the Torah is not shekol echad yisaper la'acherim, that everybody else says to other people, v'otana shomim shuv yitztarchu la'atzor yisaper lo la'acherim, and then everybody else has to tell somebody else. This isn't like Kiddush Levana, I say Shalom Aleichem to you, and then you have to say Shalom Aleichem to me, and then I have to say it to somebody else. I don't have to tell you the Haggadah, and then you tell me the Haggadah, and then I tell somebody else the Haggadah. What is it? Ella, dekach geder ha-mitzvah, middle of that third, the second underlined red line. Dekach geder ha-mitzvah, shekol ha-mishtatfim b'sipur, that anybody who participates in this storytelling, Hainu hamasaper v'shoma'av kulam yotzim b'kach yidei chavato b'mitzvat sipur. There is no obligation to say every word of the text of the Haggadah. What is the obligation? To tell a story. If it's one of you there, you have to tell the whole story. If there's two of you, you should share that story. If there's 3 or 4 or 5, if there's a family around the table, if it's just yourself, this is about telling stories. And sometimes I should say, this is our message. Haggadah on Seder night is a unique and radically different kind of obligation. It is not a liturgical prayer. It is not a recitation from a Baal Koreh. It is not a Megillah. it is not a davening, it is not Birchat Kohanim. There is no obligation to say every word. There is an obligation to tell the story. And it is stories that in times of crisis can save us. And I want to head toward our conclusion with two short quotes, one of which on your top right-hand side, I hope I'm not blocking it and you can see, is a conversation between Rabbi Sachs and Simon Sharma. Simon Sharma is a British historian, by which I mean he's a historian who happens to be British, although he did write a work on British history, but he also wrote a book called The Story of the Jews that was made into a PBS documentary special called The Story of the Jews in 5 parts, fabulously made, worth seeing. And here in his conversation with his ordinary wit and ordinary eloquence makes a point that may sound familiar to many of us.
Jews essentially communicate by agreed mutual interruption. You know, that's our basic form of...
Did you catch that? Jews essentially communicate by agreed mutual interruption, which means we sit around nodding, waiting, not really listening, waiting for our turn. Thank you. Now I'm going to say my piece. That is agreed mutual interruption. And the point that we're going to make is, though that's funny and likely quite true, though not just limited to Jews, Pesach is an interruption to that pattern of interruption, where we are not just sitting and waiting for my obligation to speak or me exploiting your words to fulfill my obligation. This is a time when I listen to you and you listen to me and we listen to each other and I listen to myself. This is not about enunciation. This is not about vocalization or utterance. This is about telling a story. And Rabbi Sachs, in a video he put out last year, makes the point that in the buildup to our emancipation, in the moments before we were freed, Moshe gives a message to the Jewish people. 3 times he tells them, when you are free, you will tell this story. When you are free, you will tell this story. And he tells them 3 times before their freedom that they will tell the story. And Rabbi Sachs wonders why on earth he says that now. Why not wait until it's over? Why not wait until they're free, until things are settled, until they can breathe, until the crisis passes, to tell them now, tell the story? And this is Rabbi Sachs' answer.
He's doing it for a most profound reason. In fact, for the reason that made Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is no slouch in political philosophy himself, regard Moses as the greatest political leader of all time, the only person ever to have endowed a people with eternity. The answer is, nations need identity. Identity needs memory, and memory depends on the story we tell ourselves and our children as to who we are.
In times of crisis, stories save us. They give us identity, they give us drive, they give us purpose, they give us hope. And that picture that is on your screens now is an image of Holland House Library, a library in London that was built in 1607, was occupied at one time by Oliver Cromwell. And as you see, this is not a prop, this is not staged. This was during the Blitz in World War II after the Germans bombed London. The library was caved in. The roof had a hole blown in it. And people still went to the library to take out books, to read stories, because stories give us hope. Stories help us thrive. Stories give us drive. And here we have, in the words of Christopher Morley, in a book that he wrote, a novel, in fact, called Parnassas on Wheels. Anyone familiar with this, the word Parnassas? Parnassas sounds almost Aramaic. In fact, it was the traditional home of the Greek muses. And this story that he wrote was about a traveling book salesman. Parnassas on Wheels, he had the house of the muses on wheels as he went around selling his books. And this is what the protagonist says in the book. When you sell a person a book, you don't sell them just 12 ounces of paper and ink and glue. You sell them a whole new life, which makes books sound suddenly like an immense bargain. We have similar words from Graham Swift, who was a British author, who wrote in his book in 1983 called Waterland, which was about a history teacher who found his students quite bored by the recitation of dates and events and political shifts and wars, and decided to alter his methodology, his pedagogy, and started telling stories about events that happened. And this is what that teacher says. The human being, let me offer you a definition, is the storytelling animal. Wherever it goes, it wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories. As long as there's a story, it's all right. And the stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell each other, do not have to be fictions. They don't have to be bought from traveling book salesmen. They don't have to come from Parnassus. The stories that we tell ourselves and we tell each other can come from our history. And the Haggadah is our story. Seder night saves us at this time of crisis by giving us a story to dive into and tell and give ourselves hope. Because as we are in the midst of this crisis, there has been a blitz on the cities of our expectations that have blown a hole in the mental roofs that shield our souls. And as it was once written, Pesach occupies a moment in the Jewish cycle of time in which we pass memory from the past through the present toward the future in the form of a story. We do not simply warm ourselves in a blanket of woven memories. We remind ourselves of truths that move us to persevere. The Seder at root is the use of memory to instill hope, to see past freedoms as antecedents of a coming redemption. It is a night in which we proclaim that with the help of heaven, we will overcome. Now, it may feel to you like a lifetime ago, but it was last night, 4 weeks ago, that we gathered at the dinner to celebrate our values and our friendship and each other. And again, it may seem like a lifetime ago, but on the tzedakah box, which we presented to the Zatzis and the Liskas, there was an inscription. And it came from the Haftorah that many of us read at home yesterday to ourselves from the prophet Malachi. V'zarcha lachem yirei shemi shemesh tzedakah. Those who fear my name, a sun of righteousness will rise. Umarpeh b'chanafeha, and healing in its wings. Hinei anochi sholech lachem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem HaGadol v'hanora, and behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before that great and awesome day. And through telling that story on Seder night, we hope to inspire ourselves, to give ourselves hope, to give ourselves drive, to let that story breathe new life into us and bring us closer to that healing sunrise. And I imagine for the first time for many of us in a very, very long time, we will mean the words that we say at the end of the Seder every year in ways we could not imagine. Hashata Avdei. This year we are enslaved. L'shana haba b'nei chorin. Next year may we be free. And I conclude by saying that I hope and wish, as I do every year, Hashata hacha. This year we are here. L'shana haba Yerushalayim Habnuya. Next year it will be Yerushalayim, celebrating together, singing together, telling that story together, and spreading hope to each other, to our friends, to our families, to the world. We wish you all a Chal Kasher v'Sameach, and we will turn to Maariv in a moment.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Beautiful.